Okay, and we are live. Janita, also fondly known as Fruit Loop, can you tell me, please, what time it is?
It is now 6:10 in the morning.
Yeah,
6 a.m.
6 a.m. Can you remind me why we are having our third potato peeling podcast at this ungodly hour?
Well, it was actually scheduled to be a little bit later this morning, but
Mhm.
then I asked you very kindly and very nicely if we can move it a little bit earlier because of plans I have with my family today.
Mhm.
you
Okay.
you wanted to move it to Monday, so I said why not do it on Friday morning very early. So what time do you wake up?
You see, this is like really good. So you let's listen to this quietly. Yeah. So you asked me very kindly if we could move it to earlier, and then I suggested Monday, and then we said, well, you said why not at 6 o'clock in the morning to keep with the podcast publishing rhythm. Anyway.
Well, I know you wake up early, and I don't mind to wake up early.
Well, that's a lovely segue to the next topic. Can I just sort of, you're dressed in warm winter clothes. Can I just
Yes,
remind you that up here in cloudy Kleeborg, rainy cloudy Kleeborg, it is balmy 17 degrees
I'm jealous. I'm very jealous. So it's only 5 degrees this morning.
only.
Only.
Does it actually ever get below zero? Do you have because
Yes. Yes, we do. So last night, as I was lying in bed scrolling on social media, like most of us do, I saw on Facebook there's a lot of cold front warnings for this weekend. So starting from tomorrow, Sunday, Monday, maybe Tuesday as well. Sometimes they say it will start on Saturday, but then it only comes on Sunday or maybe only on Monday. But then the temperatures drop to 0, -1, -2, -3. And there's also some places in South Africa where it might snow over the weekend.
mm, whereabouts?
Mostly the mountains, so Drakensberg, Lesotho.
So
And then also yes, also more
northeast,
to
northeast, yeah.
Cape
Really?
Town side. Yes,
Really, that far south? I thought that Cape Town would have a
yes.
much more mild climate. Sort of, we have this image of it always
No,
being sunny.
freezing in
Really?
winter. Yes.
Okay. So I'm getting it all confused. I need some lessons in South African geography, history, and everything. So I think you need to teach me a few things there. Durban has more a tropical.
Tropical.
So
Yes,
so
yes,
if you
tropical weather.
so
So
if you
if we, sorry. So if we decide to go on a beach trip during winter, we can still go to Durban.
uh, okay, so that's sort of like a 2 hour drive from where you are in Johannesburg. Yeah.
No, no, that's actually 6 hours.
6 hours for 3 hours on the beach. Yeah. Okay.
No, we will create a whole holiday out of it.
Okay. Sort of like a long. Can you do it on a sort of a weekend, long weekend,
On
even
a
leave?
long weekend, yes, the drive there is just actually terrible. But it depends where you are going. So closer to, we don't usually go into Durban. We go around Durban,
Mm.
Belito, Mums and Toti, those kind of places. Um, then the drive doesn't feel so grueling. But if we decide to go to places like Ivongo or Margate, that's a little bit further, let's say further south from Durban. So it's
Hmm.
also very nice places to go, but the drive is even longer.
Okay. Okay.
Yes,
But
because
but
basically you drive to Durban and then you turn south, then you go down even more.
okay. And the roads are they? I mean,
The roads are very, very busy, and one of them goes through It's called Van der Renens Pass. So you go over the mountains, through the mountains, down the mountains again. And there's a lot of trucks traveling from the harbor, from Durban to Johannesburg, and from Johannesburg down to the harbor. So trucks on that road there's a lot.
Okay.
There's no way that you can count all of them.
Mary and I, we used to have there used to be a French logistics company called Norbert, and Norbert Destangela, and they got taken over by some other company. And sort of when I met Mary, and then we sort of took on one of her old family hobbies when traveling, to count how many Norberts you see. Okay. And sort of we drove down to the south of France, and we would have this list, and we actually drove past the main depot of, and there's like about a zillion of them parked there. And then I remember we were in England once, and I was watching, I think, the lunchtime news or something, and there was this Norbert truck driving past the reporter who was doing his report on something, and this thing drove past, and I shouted to Mary, "How many points for a Norbert on television? 3 million!" And then at the end of the year, this is how silly it gets. At the end of the year, we sort of count all the points, and then we say, okay, so this was this year's Norbert points, so next year we're going to do the same. See how we go.
We usually do that when we go to the Kruger National Park. So each animal, we give a certain amount of points. Like a lion would be 50 points. Basic antelope, that would be 1 point. Zebra would be 2 points. Blue wild beast will also be like 2 points. Elephants, 50 points. But then if you see smaller things like a snake or a chameleon, or there's a small little antelope, it's called a klipspringer. So if you see these, you will get 1,000 points. Wow. So we started this with my parents as a way to entertain ourselves, and also to keep us focused and concentrated.
This is what I love about our podcast. You just casually drop, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Oh, when we go to Kruger National Park, lovely.
So the drive, what I've noticed with my husband and my son, the drive to the Kruger National Park is a lot easier, and the roads aren't as busy as when we go to Durban, for example. And it's a 5-hour drive with a lot of beautiful stops along the way, and nice scenery, also mountains. And so I prefer to go that way.
This is the revenge for our Lunch with Janita and Frank podcast yesterday, isn't it? Because I sort of dismissed your country a little bit, this insignificant.
That's okay.
Place and chose something totally. So I'm getting the hard spiel back.
I'm just making you jealous because I can't do it with the weather, so I'll have to try something else.
Yeah, and I actually did there's a Swiss company called Kuoni Tours, and they offered a trip around South Africa, starting in, I think it was in Cape Town actually, and then you sort of drove around all the typical tourist spots, and then you ended up in Stanton in Johannesburg or something. That's one suburb of Johannesburg, which
yes, Stanton. Yes,
is it Stanton? Yeah.
That's the luxurious section of Johannesburg.
Yeah, I got that because I was so immersed in researching this trip and putting together something. And I'd really gone into there were some really weird and wonderful places. And then I got to Stanton and I thought, no, I don't want to be here. It was,
you don't want to go to the big city.
This is all like, on paper researching. None of it was actually me being in South Africa. It was simply the imagination of it. Anyway, so you've had a somewhat traumatic week, judging from the WhatsApp counter, and it all started. It started a little on a dramatic Monday. Yeah.
Yes.
What happened?
Blue Monday.
Blue Monday.
So it actually started on Sunday when my son, it's actually my stepson, like but he came back from his real mom, and he was ill, like flu, stuffy nose, coughing, terrible, complaining about his head hurting. And then on Sunday evening, my husband said he shouldn't go to school the next day. We should keep him at home, see if we can make him feel better. And on Sunday night, he was coughing the whole night. I tried everything. Rubbed him with Vicks, sprayed nasal spray into his nose, gave him coughing medicine, put him on his side because he likes to sleep on his back. And then also we have a nebulizer, so I let him steam himself, but that didn't work. And I was up until 3 a.m. in the morning with his coughing, and he didn't stop. So then my husband was sleeping already, so I sent him a WhatsApp and I said, I'm going to take him to the doctor tomorrow morning because I can't go through another night like this. I need help. And then on Monday morning, the doctor's offices have a website where you can book an appointment online.
Yeah, we have that here too.
So I don't have to wake up too early to phone them to get an appointment, but the system wasn't working. So I think the reason why is the doctor that we usually see wasn't available on Monday, and I only went into her name. So she's I think she should have retired 10 years ago, but she's still working. But she's very clever. She's very smart. She's witty. She's funny, and she's very, very good with kids too. So when I couldn't book appointment online at 3 a.m. in the morning, I decided that I will wake up a little bit earlier the next day to phone to make an appointment. So by 6 a.m., my son was coughing again. I was awake, and I could only phone them at 8 a.m. because they only open at 8 a.m., which is reasonable. So I phoned them and made an appointment with another doctor. I thought it was one of the others that I've seen before, but it wasn't. It was a completely new doctor, which was fine. She's also female, but she's maybe half the age of the one that we normally see. So we actually saw her for, I think it was 15 minutes in total. But we waited almost 3 hours to see her.
Now that in itself is possibly a little different to what we have here. So here in France, we have an app where you can choose your doctor and then book an appointment online, and then you go through. What tends to happen here is that many GPs do not actually accept appointments, but you sort of go to the waiting room and then you sit and wait until it is your turn. Yeah, and if the waiting room is full, you know you've got a long wait. You then decide, do I come back later or do I
come back tomorrow morning?
Go back tomorrow. Yeah. But so why did you have to wait so long? And healthcare sort of being one of these universal global topics on this planet, how does it actually work in South Africa?
Okay. So it's kind of divided into two parts.
Okay.
So doctors in my town, let's just go back to that. Okay. Doctors in my town are also very, let's say, picky with appointments.
Oh.
Yes. So they will only take 4 walk-ins. That's if you don't have an appointment. They will only take 4 walk-ins for the day. They do make set appointments for patients that they've had for years. They don't generally accept new patients. So they kind of stick to the ones they have on file. And I hate that. I hate that about them.
Please be sick when the doctor can receive you, don't you know?
Yes. Let's just schedule on this day you will have flu or something terrible is happening and you have to see a doctor, and they tell you, oh, sorry, I can't see you today. But anyway, so the doctor's rooms that we actually go to is about 10 kilometers away. It's in Three Rivers, not too far from us.
Mm.
And they have 6 rotating doctors. So the one is the one that we always see, but she wasn't available on Monday, which is fine. There's one doctor, he only does walk-ins. So the waiting room will be packed with people, but he spends 10 minutes per patient. So if they walk in, he will take the file, call the names, see them, 10 minutes. He walks them out, takes the next one. He's fast, but he's also a little bit older.
Okay.
Then there's 2 other younger doctors. I didn't see them on Monday though.
Mm.
But then there was the one that we saw on Monday. She's new. That was her first day.
Oh dear.
Yes. So from what she apologized for us for waiting that long before we could see her. And then she said that it was her first day. That's how I know it was her first day. And she also mentioned that she had a medical emergency earlier the morning. So someone came in, they were actually severely ill, and she had to help them, obviously, to get to the hospital and all of those things. And the system, they do everything on the computer. Everything is digital, and she's used to writing. So having a file, actually writing on the file, oh, this and this and this is wrong, and this is what I prescribed. Now she has to enter everything into the system, and that was new to her. So the morning she had to do a quick crash course on how this works. And then she had the medical emergency, and then she was so far behind with seeing her patients. But when we saw her, it was about, so our appointment was scheduled for 1 p.m. and we only saw her, it was 2:30 that we actually walked into her office.
Good grief. Okay, well, I mean,
Yes.
you know, you put,
So,
it into,
like,
you put it into context. It's all understandable. I mean, you know, there is somebody.
Yes.
How did your son? I mean, how does a 6-year-old boy survive 3 hours waiting for a doc when he's coughing up a storm, as you wrote? Yeah, so.
So he actually watched some videos on my phone and play some games on my phone. That's the only way.
Yeah. 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 So
because there's really nothing else to do.
Okay, so what happens here in France is we have this universal health insurance, pretty much state run, and then you have complementary health insurance because doctors will, so a doctor's visit will cost 25 euros. And that is, depending where you are in France, paid between 70 and 80% of that is covered by the health insurance. And if you do not have a complementary health insurance, you have to pay the difference yourself. And that, and you pay by credit card or debit card or cash or something like that. And then France is, the healthcare system is actually very good. It's very fragmented. You've got lots of little specialists, and they don't tend to really communicate much with each other, even though all the files are on a central database. And then, because of that, everything is transparent. So you can actually see what it costs, especially for bigger operations and things like that. It's actually all very transparent and almost itemized. What's it like with South Africa?
So we have public hospitals, like government hospitals and government. If you want to see a doctor, if you don't have a medical aid, you can go to these doctors at the government hospitals or public hospitals. But they are terrible. It's really, really bad. I've been to a public hospital in Vereniging, which is also about 15 kilometers, maybe 20 from here. It was a long time ago. We took a farm worker to this hospital because they didn't have medical aid. And he sat there in the waiting room. A horse actually jumped on him. That's a story for another day.
Okay.
But anyway, so we took him there. And there was a guy sitting with an axe in his head with a ticket. They have tickets.
Oh, stop.
They have tickets. So there's a green ticket, yellow ticket, red ticket. Red ticket, you need to be helped as soon as possible, as fast as they can. But if you have a yellow ticket, you're still okay. Green ticket, you'll find you can wait a little bit. So this guy with an axe in his head had a green ticket. So
I don't believe it.
Yes, that is how bad it is. And it's called Kopanong Hospital. It used to be one of the best medical facilities in the past, with the best doctors, the best technology, all kinds of things you could find there. And a lot of resident doctors went there for training. But now it just completely fell apart.
This could be actually a politically sensitive question.
Yes, let's just say yes.
Okay, all right. Let's moving swiftly on. So you have the state system, which if you're sitting, warning to our listeners and viewers, please do not go to that hospital with an axe on your head. You'll be treated, just the thought of it. Okay.
You need a medical aid. Right. So most companies will pay for medical aid, but some of them, it depends on the company's policies and procedures and KPIs and all kinds of things. But for if I think back to when I worked for a company, they paid half of it. They paid half of the medical aid. They give you 3 options. You can choose which medical aid you see fit. And then they pay half and you pay half. Okay. So just for me at that time was about 2,500 rand.
It's about 100 euros.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the total amount. And then if you pay, like, you can add your family members to this medical aid, but then you pay for them as well. The companies don't pay for them. Some companies do pay the full medical aid, the full medical benefit, like my father's company, but his is actually a Swiss company based in South Africa. So they pay the full medical aid for him and my mom.
Okay.
Yes. And at the moment, we pay 5,500 rand for our medical aid, which is me, my husband, and my son.
Wow.
But it does include some things, or most things. You can go to the doctor, you can go to the dentist. If you end up in hospital, you can go to hospital. They will pay all the expenses. I can go to the optometrist for my glasses. And then they also pay medicine. So for my whole trip on Monday, I just had to pay 160 rand for the medicine. So the doctor's visit was covered. You mentioned earlier what the cost is of a doctor's visit. So if you pay for that cash, it's also about 400 rand, 450 rand.
Right. Okay. So just divide by 20 and then you get the euros. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So the medicine that the doctor prescribed, there's one item in particular I know most medical aids do not cover that particular medicine. And that is why I had to pay a levy. It's just
Okay.
because they didn't pay the full amount for that. It's a small tube.
Mm,
It's probiotics.
yeah.
So they don't normally pay for the probiotics, but they did pay half of it. So
Mm,
I just had to pay the other half because it's
okay.
quite expensive.
So one thing that we have here is an incredible shortage of doctors and especially specialists. So um, where I live, and this is important to me, is we only have one cardiologist, and his waiting list
Oh my goodness.
is over 2 years. So if you do not have a rotating appointment with him, you just basically have to travel 30, maybe 50 kilometers further to find another cardiologist. That's a serious problem because the way the French system works, um, um, it's geared towards um, skill sets. And if you do not pass certain level tests, you at best become a midwife. At even better, you can become a qualified doctor. And that has had a knock-on effect now that we probably have a lot of midwives in this country, but we don't actually have any qualified any specialists. Uh,
Yes.
and instead of reforming the system on how you become a doctor, the university education, the training, it being the European Union, doctors from other European countries come to France and fill the void. So it's basically your story, and if we compare this with what goes on in other countries, and sort of everybody looks towards the United States and says, how do they do it? Healthcare, wherever you go globally, seems to be an issue.
Yes.
Um, it has its good points, it has its bad points. And just thank you for sharing that with us, because it's one of these questions that sort of bubbles up every now and then.
Yes.
And we just sort of like to compare notes. But so the episode on Monday with your son, and he's feeling better, I think. Yeah,
Much better.
yeah.
Much
So
better.
the
He's
drugs,
starting to drive us crazy again.
that's a sign of a healthy child. Yeah.
Yes.
If the parents start complaining about the fact that he's too lively, too hyperactive,
That's
too
okay.
enthusiastic, then
Let me know he's feeling better.
okay, brilliant. Well, that's good to hear. But
Yes.
anyway, so this episode on Monday, sort of, you had your week nicely mapped out, sort of, and wanting to do a few things,
Did. I
and
did.
then it went pear-shaped, to say the
Yes.
least. Yeah. Um,
Yes.
and you, after you had sort of had done the revolution in Brida, watch previous episodes of this,
Yes.
you sort of had a little revolution at home because things weren't going the way you wanted to. And this spilled over into two of our ongoing discussion topics here in the breeder community, which is art therapy.
Yes.
And our Dear Abby column.
Yes. And maybe
Uh,
some other social media platforms that's not sponsored or connected.
that's outside our scope.
Yes.
But you let loose a rant. I think that's all we can say to this.
Running for the hills.
Mrs. Running for the Hills. So to the poor unsuspecting listener and viewer, can you tell us a little bit about what this Dear Abby thing is that we are running, and what happens and what you did? And I don't know if you actually responded, you read the response, but there was one response by Claire from South Korea, which really.
No, I actually missed it.
You
I
missed
have
it.
to,
Well, you tell
yes.
us what happened, and I will tell you. I will tell you the story to that. Yeah. So, dear Abby, courtesy of Fruit Loop here. So tell us what
Yes.
happened.
So the Dear Abby column that we have is just something fun to get our members interactive on the platform, to actually talk to each other and to respond on certain scenarios and things. Like previously, you lost your hose pipe. And
Yes,
I
thank
had
you.
a lot of fun with that.
I'm
Sorry, I
sure.
had to.
Yes,
And
I still
so,
haven't found it, by the way.
oh no,
Still running around the planet. So any
it's
listeners,
still on holiday.
you're still on holidays, yeah. Probably on permanent because it's now been replaced, and it's probably snuck back and had a look and said, "Oh, I've been replaced. I'm no longer wanted. I'm going to go again." So I think it's now in a permanent exile. Yeah. Anyway.
So this week I wrote on Dear Abby, it feels like I don't have enough time. I don't have time to relax, even though I do have some leave from another, let's say,
Another
contract,
contract.
yes. And I want to watch a little bit of Netflix. I want to read a book. I just want to sit on the couch and do nothing. And it feels like I want to run for the hills. That's basically it in short.
That's basically it. So this age-old problem, of trying to figure out priorities. You've got some time, which was possibly a little bit unexpected in your case,
Yes.
at least the duration of it, and then you have all these plans, and then life, let's put it diplomatically,
life happens.
Life happens in the form of other people in one's life.
And it throws curveballs, like having to spend 3 hours at the doctor.
Exactly. And then you sort of question your very being and existence, etc.
Yes, yes.
And Claire, so one of the community members in South Korea.
South Korea.
Get it right, Frank. Because you were questioning, one of the things that you have said, was you've not done anything meaningful. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And this 18-year-old young lady in South Korea who's about to move to Edinburgh, she's French, wrote this most amazing reply.
I have to check it. I don't know how I missed that. I was actually on it yesterday.
It depends. It might have come later. I don't know what time you were on, but it was anyway. It doesn't matter. Okay. So she wrote, "Well, actually, looking after one's family is meaningful."
It is, yes.
And I thought, this is
wow.
This is like, we don't think of this. It's sort of like it's seen as a chore.
Yes.
Yeah. But what you did with your son on Monday not only is that of a parental responsibility, you have to take your doctor, your child to the doctor if he's coughing up a storm. I mean, anything else would be irresponsible.
Yes.
But it's also very, very meaningful. You dedicate 3 hours exploring the interior design of the waiting room.
It's green chairs, lime green chairs. Very uncomfortable.
Anyway,
no pictures on the walls either.
No pictures on the wall. I think Fruit Loop, you need to go and change that. Anyway, so that was like this really interesting response. And then the second part is that we've also created something for the Brida community, which I thought, okay, we've discussed it, and then you presented it on Monday. I did it myself on Monday evening. So what did we introduce? This.
So it was the art therapy. So last week in our previous podcast, we did actually talk about it a little bit, and I shared some of my idea with you. But how this works, there's a weekly prompt that you have to sit down and draw something. I actually have mine here. Just wait.
Yes.
So you have to, sorry, so this week the prompt was to doodle.
Mm.
Um, so if you don't know what a doodle is, it's just
Which
when
is
you sit down and scratch a little bit of flowers here and there, maybe a heart or two, or maybe a knife or whatever. However your day went.
yeah.
If you are sitting in a meeting, not playing knots and crosses with yourself
Mm.
or
Mm.
whatever else. But if you are still not sure, you can just Google doodles.
Mm.
There's millions.
Mm.
Um, so that is actually quite very therapeutic. And
I can second that. That is really
yes,
the case. So yeah.
yes. So the name actually comes from it's connected to the haikus. So
Yes.
the haikus, to sit down and to write a haiku, which I feel terrible about. I haven't done any this week.
Well,
Eventually.
in all fairness, it kind of fell by the wayside because this thing called life got in the way. Yeah.
Yes. But
Yeah.
that's the problem. It only takes like 5 minutes or 10 minutes to write a haiku.
Yeah, but sometimes these 10 minutes can be totally and utterly elusive. Yeah, but
Yes. Anyways, so and I think it's also because I like to work on a schedule and a routine, and now everything is just thrown out of proportion.
well,
Okay, but moving back to the art therapy. Um, so in a way, the name made sense to me because the haikus feel like therapy. Whenever you write a haiku, um, you share a part of yourself or you dig deep to find words to match with each other
mm,
to write a haiku. So the
mm,
same with the doodles. You also sit and think about your day. What can I draw?
mm,
How can I add this to my picture? And that is why it's therapeutic. You draw whatever comes to mind or whatever you feel like drawing. And
yeah,
every week there's a new challenge.
yeah.
But
So
it's a weekly challenge. So haikus, we have daily haiku words,
yeah,
and the art therapy is a week, one whole
as
week.
is a week. Yeah.
Yes.
But I had to sort of because my Monday wasn't probably as intense as yours, but sort of, your son's doctor experience sort of did flow up 8,500 or whatever kilometers up north to here. It
Yes.
sort of occupied me, at least my thinking, um, and in this whole rebuilding of the breeder community, and I sent you a short reel before we met this morning. So this actually started about 5:30. This whole discussion between you and me
Yes.
this morning. Yeah, we were early birds. About how trees grow in two directions,
Yes.
and growing the roots is probably the foundation work naturally, and at some point
Yes.
this whole thing bursts open into the open and then continues. So that was a lot of my week, and on Monday evening I was sort of feeling pretty blah, and I did this art therapy.
Yes.
And okay, I didn't doodle. And so on Saturday, I went out and bought a small sketch block and a couple of pencils, as you told me to. And I sat outside in our courtyard. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening. It was warm. It was still light. Doesn't get so we're coming up to the summer equinox, so it doesn't get dark until about 10 o'clock, 10:15 here. And I sat outside in the courtyard looking at our gigantic fig tree in front of the church, and I drew the day. And the
Yes.
beauty of it is you don't have to be an artist. You don't
No,
have
you don't have to be a professional.
you don't. You just draw something, you doodle, you drew. And it maybe took me 15 minutes.
Yes.
I didn't write any words, I didn't make any notes, I didn't do anything longhand, I didn't do anything out of the Cheerio world. You have minutes and all this weird and wonderful stuff. I just drew
Yes.
the picture, 15 minutes, and it felt really good. I had sort of
Yes.
thrown the day onto paper. I posted it into the community just to sort of show people how this works. And it is, but it is private. If you do not want to do that, then you don't have to. Yeah.
Yes.
And then I showed it to some other people. And notably Alexandra, who lives here just a couple of kilometers away from us. And he really likes it. He's a osteopath, very much into meditation and Zen and so on. And he actually almost wanted to start drawing then and there. He said, "Where's this piece of paper?" And I said, "Well, actually, you have to talk to me. This is what you are here for."
Yes, you have to talk now, draw later.
Yeah. And then I showed my picture to Claire, and she sort of worked way through it. And even Sylvie, who is sort of like snowed under with work, and who also then she supported you and said, "Yes, I know exactly where you're coming from. I now have I do not feel alone in this world."
Yes,
She said, wrote that to dear Abby. She said she's going to give it a try. Whether she will do this remains to be seen. But okay, there you go. So the origin of this comes back from what the origin of your art therapy idea comes back from what Brida started off with. We've discussed that a couple of times.
Yes.
But like you said, what does this have to do with articulating yourself in English? Well, you draw a picture, you do something really nice for yourself.
Yes.
You spend a little bit of me time, sort of figuring things out and sort of just emptying the system.
Yes.
And if you're comfortable with it, you share it with others in the community and you talk about it. They ask questions, and out of this evolves a discussion.
Yes.
A very meaningful discussion.
Yes, exactly. So you can discuss it, or maybe write a story about it, or also something that I mentioned is to write a haiku about it.
Exactly.
So just an idea for the viewers. There's mine.
Yes.
The very, very busy doodle.
Yeah.
But so I have the word Monday, there's the sun, there's a very angry looking cloud, there's some boxing gloves. The boxing gloves can obviously start a conversation. There's a glass of wine, there's a very tired face, there's an ice cream. I didn't have an ice cream, but I was feeling like buying an ice cream.
In the middle of winter, yeah.
In the middle of winter. There's also my pencils, because I was doodling while I was sitting in my bed before going to sleep. But I don't think it looks like pencils.
Well,
but anyways, that doesn't matter. You don't have to be perfect. But then to start a conversation, like, why did you draw cheesecake next to the ice cream? Or why do you have a clock? That's quite obvious for the people who know, like you and myself, like the time.
Yeah, exactly. But then in that doodle, and it's actually more than a doodle. It's almost a work of art. And you said, look, I know how to paint because you like painting. You do excellent paintings, but you said you can't draw. And I'm looking at this, she can't draw. My goodness, if that's not drawing, I don't know what it is. But there were some things in that work that you produced that you hadn't shared with anybody except, of course, the immediate family concerned. The what's on the bottom right-hand corner. So there are things then that you put in, or one can put in. But I think it's also important to stress that if you share this with the community, you have to be your own censor, because somebody will ask you, and that somebody could even be most likely me, and who will say, well, what's that down there? And then you have to be prepared to speak about it. And if you don't want to speak about it, then don't put it into the picture, or somehow cover it or do something with it. But the basic foundation of all of this is speak about what you want to speak. If you don't want to share it, then don't do that. Anyway, so So that was so so. And don't worry, don't feel bad about not writing any haikus, because as you also know, our resident poet, her contribution this week was also at an ebb, because she was in Norway this week on
Yes.
a trip, on a well,
Very beautiful pictures that you sent, though.
oh yes. Next time we have to ask whether we should carry her luggage for her.
Yes. Can I
So,
hide in a bag?
well, now there's an idea. Yeah, if you were a stowaway, where would you go? Yeah, etc. Bohumila, because she was so insanely busy this week, didn't really have time to
Yes.
share any haikus, so that's okay. But Sarah, she is the one who posts the word of the
Yes.
week, or the words of the week.
Yes.
I hope she does something on Monday again, because it's really, really good.
I was thinking about it last night, actually. If she's not going to, then I will help her this week. I
Yes.
will help her
Okay.
out. But
Okay.
I will send a message, not today because it's their holiday as
Holidays.
well.
Yeah.
So maybe tomorrow just ask her and then see if
Then
she'll still do it.
exactly.
Yes.
But that's and I share that outside of the community, and that's beginning to resonate as well.
Yes.
But she has some cracking words there. And just to sit down and
Yes.
write a haiku again, think of the words, the syllables, etc. It's good fun. So you're not alone with your lack of
But some
haikus.
is I have a list of words that I missed. It's a long list.
Okay. Well,
Because
um,
there's some words, some of Sarah's words, the one is solitude and the other one is abyss.
mm,
So I really, really want to write a haiku about those two words.
yeah,
I don't know why, but the moment she sent me the words and I read them, I'm like, I have to use this. So
yeah.
the other ones too. And the way she thought was to choose two easy words, to a little bit more difficult, and then the most difficult words.
Mm.
And I think she does well.
She does exceedingly well, because
Yes.
the word abyss is actually not that difficult, but it's just the mental thinking that
Yes.
goes
How
behind
to put that into a
into
haiku. Yes.
not, and it's not just the technical, but to actually write something about it. Yeah,
Yes.
and that's
Yes.
why I like what. So kudos to Sarah. She lives in Saudi Arabia. Um, they've got a major holiday this weekend, and sort of with what they're
Yes.
doing at the moment. It's a bit quiet on that front, but she has done exceedingly well. So Sarah,
Yes.
if you watch this, then it goes out to you. A huge thank you. Right, I'm sort of conscious of the time a little bit. We have another thing, and this actually led me to an idea this morning. It is actually possible. So you are affectionately known as Fruit Loop,
Yes.
because of your positive, colorful dynamics thinking,
Yes.
and that you pose these curveball questions, maybe that at first, sort of thinking, what kind of question is this? Uh, is this?
It sounds silly, like silly questions, ridiculous questions. But
Yeah,
when you start thinking about them, you realize that this is actually way deeper than I thought.
exactly. So I was thinking, because something we couldn't do in last week's podcast. We've got a Fruit Loop question, which I want to ask you, and I think you've thought of something. But I'm just wondering whether in the Fruit Loop Club in Brida Town, because it's been a bit quiet there, this
Yes.
world famous Fruit Loop Club.
Yes.
Um, Maybe it's been on holidays as well. I was just wondering whether we should do a Fruit Loop question of the week.
Okay. Yes. I like that.
I know you do. Um, some random, oh, it's raining here. Some random silly question, which sort of think.
It can also, like the questions that I asked you last week in our previous podcast.
What, put me on
If
the
you're,
spot?
if no, what is your I deserve a trophy moment for this
Yes.
week? Or if your week were a smoothie, what weird ingredients would be in it? Or if you had to name your week after a fruit, which one fits best and why? And then also, the other question I asked was, if your week had a theme song played by a marching band of oranges, what would it be?
Yeah, and that was probably the most Fruit Loopy, but it's sort of it's the thing is, it actually stuck with me the
Yes.
entire week, because I sort of have this vision of marching bands full of oranges walking down the street.
For me, it was a trophy question.
It was a trophy question.
If I do something, I deserve a trophy.
Exactly.
And I did this, I deserve a trophy.
And I think you got a couple of trophies this week.
I think, did I draw one?
You did.
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't. No, I can't.
No, I didn't. I was thinking about it. I didn't draw one, but I was thinking about it.
Okay. Well, and I cannot look at a pineapple in the same way anymore. And pineapple sort of, and you did this wonderful, because we're going to launch next week. We're going to launch our LinkedIn newsletter, The Pineapple.
Yes.
And you did some really wonderful artwork on that as well. So that's going to be good fun. Anyway, so Fruit Loop question. So I thought, here you go. Maybe you can sort of, because only you can do this. Yeah.
Okay.
Do the Fruit Loop question of the week.
Yes.
And then people, again, how does this work? In our respective meetings with the Brida community, either, and we could actually put this into the lunch with Janita and Frank's slot, and with our crème brûlées on Wednesday evenings.
Yes.
We'll just promote that and say, look, go in and answer the question as best as you can.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, critical thinking, humor, creativity, seriousness, it all flows into these things. So do not discount the Fruit Loop question. Anyway, so the one that we had from last week, which we couldn't answer because we were running out of time. If Brida were a bookshop, where would you shelve it and why? Or if Brida were a book in a bookshop, or where would you shelve the books?
Yes, a book in a bookshop.
Okay. So I am really curious, because probably to the Fruit Loop question now I get a Fruit Loop answer, which is going to occupy me for the rest of the day. So what have you?
No, actually, I have a very Cheerio question answer.
Oh, okay.
So I was thinking about this, because Brida has a lot of different sections, a lot of different topics, a lot of different things that come to it. And also because of the people, everyone has a different personality, different things they like, different interests, different places they live. We've noticed that some of them are boxed in where they are. They just focus on that. Others dream big. They want to explore everything in the world. So the book, if Brida were a book, it can fit into literary fiction, because it can focus on style, the character, the theme, or maybe even the plot. What is the story? It can also fit into a fantasy.
Definitely that, yes.
With a magical and imaginary worlds. So that is what Brida is. It's an imaginary town. So that's how it can fit into the fantasy section. It can also be an adventure, because it is action-packed. There's always things happening.
Yes. Dramas.
And dramas, yes. It can also fit into the drama section. But these stories in the adventures involves our members, their quests, and what kind of dangers they go through, or the things they have to conquer every day. So that is how it can fit into the adventure. Then, in a way, it can also fit into a new adult section, because it can focus on the characters between 18 and 25 years old, dealing with adulting, how to be an adult, things that most of us forgot, or we're still trying every single day.
Yeah. And therein actually hides a very important recurring theme, and I put this onto my sketch on Monday as well. We can actually learn a lot from the Gen Zs.
Yes.
As Claire sort of pointedly pointed out to you, said, well, actually taking care of your family is meaningful.
Yes,
well, actually,
some things that you don't think about. You think you want to paint something, or you want to write something, or you want to sit down and watch a series, or you want to do something with your free time. And then she says, well, taking care of your family, that's part of it. Wow. Thank you.
Talk about a boxing glove, eh?
Yes.
Yeah. And this is what I like about what we're establishing here.
Yes.
That with this huge community, we're global. We're not huge. We're too small. We need to grow, but that's part of our game plan.
Yes.
But we sit in different countries and different parts of the planet, different ages, and we all share humanity and what it is that and 64-year-old learning from an 18-year-old is the magic in this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And just like in lunch in Janita with our lunch session yesterday, almost everybody wanted to go to Australia so that they see this.
Yes.
This paradise on the other side of the planet. And our elder statesman, Bruce, sort of is almost the exact opposite. Well, actually, he doesn't want to move anymore.
Yes.
He's been living in the same area. I don't know if it's the same house, but at least in the same area of London for the last 50 years. And he brings in a totally different perspective. When he said he'd like to go to Botswana, I thought, oh God, here we go. So we're going to have an hour dominating between your experiences in Botswana and his desire to go there.
It depends where in Botswana you want to go. That's why I didn't mention too much about it.
Well, thank you. And we had to cut short Rosie in Sao Paulo because I think she was being paid by the Brazilian tourist authorities because she was rattling on about Brazil for hours on end. And then I just throw in a completely different perspective. I said, well, actually, I'd like to go to North Korea for a year just because it's different. Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So all these different perspectives coming in, this is the magic. So in answer to your question, so Brida cannot be a book. It is the bookshop.
It is the bookshop, yes, because I have some others as well. Like you mentioned, we help each other or give advice. So it can also be part of the self-help section. It can also be a part of the health and wellness to focus on physical and mental health with our art therapy and haikus. And
exactly. Yeah.
There's also the cookbook section,
which is lying a little bit dormant, but I need to speak to Ralph about that next week to activate that. Yeah. So it is life in a box, really, this thing. So and I suppose a little bit underdeveloped, but we can actually have a business and management section for those who are into that sort of thing. I just sort of imagine, you have a high-ranking senior manager somewhere being confronted by one of your Fruit Loop questions. That would be
that would be interesting.
That would be fun. But watch this space.
And fun, yes, definitely.
Watch this space. Okay. So let's test your spontaneity here.
Okay.
And maybe we can put this into the first Fruit Loop question of the week type thing. So if your feelings could wear clothes, what would they dress like today? If your feelings could wear clothes, what would they dress like today?
The first color that comes to mind is yellow.
Okay.
But yellow as in happiness, and I feel much better today after doing nothing yesterday.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's also a story for another day. Well, if it weren't for the weather, I would definitely be wearing a summer dress with flowers with the color yellow on it. And some comfortable sandals. I think so. A summer dress with flowers on it, sandals.
The interesting thing is that you're, I was thinking how would I answer this question, because men have a totally different approach to, we have to, we wear the same thing, trousers, shirts, sweatshirts, rugby shirts, and certain prominent figures just wear the same thing,
Yes.
and if you see them in public wearing a suit or something, you think, oh God, it does not, because you're used to seeing wearing them, jeans and a t-shirt, and then they appear in the
Yes.
suit. So no, this is not him. Yeah, but
Yes.
there we go. The beauty is, of course, I should be answering the question myself, but I can't at the moment because, and it's making me think. How do you equate? How do you combine feelings, clothes? Because I think it's a typical female thing. Is you people have never anything to wear. You open your massive wardrobes, you stare at it and say, oh, I've got nothing to wear. Maybe because you actually haven't sorted out your mood for the day yet. Yeah,
I think so.
You're trying to figure out what it is that how do I want to feel today, and then that will determine
Yes.
what you're going to wear. And because I'm not feeling anything, I'm not got nothing to wear. So there you go. Yeah, right.
I do wear a lot of pink, and then in the winter it's a little bit darker colors, but like blues and greens and but also pink.
Yeah.
But I think for today, I'm wearing blue jeans and my blue sweatshirt with my white stripes on it. I put on this blue greenish scarf this morning because it was a little bit chilly and I hate my neck being cold.
Oh, okay.
And then the overcoat is nice and fluffy on the inside to keep me warm while we talk to each other. But if we go to the zoo later, I will leave the overcoat, change the scarf to a pink one.
Exactly. Okay.
And then, yes.
And then we go from there. Okay.
Yes.
So you gave me the hint that we should stop here because you and your family are going to
No, they are still sleeping. We can still talk for another hour or 2 hours before they'll be ready.
Well, you and I can. That's the beauty of it. We could probably talk all day. But I don't know. Probably with the people looking at the watch, when are they going to stop now? So let's wrap this up, and then we can talk afterwards. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. So what have we got planned for next week? So in are we going to the crème brûlée? Are we going to do a repeat of the first question that we had? So the if we could go for a year, or do we want to skip that one and go to the second one, which is also ties in with the lunch with Janita and Frank, which is our favorite movement, which again, who came up with that? Was that one of yours or one of mine?
That was one of yours.
Oh my God, I must have been crazy. I need to speak to Rosie. Yeah. So our favorite movement.
Yes.
Are we going to do that one on our crème brûlée on Wednesday, or?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
We'll keep them in tandem. Okay.
Yes.
And we're going to launch our newsletter on Thursday.
Yes.
We've got a whole host of other slots that we're going to open up so that people can join us.
Yes, at different times.
Different times.
Every day, not just once a week.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we're rolling all that out next week for soft launch, and then we really hit the button the week after.
Yes.
So I always say this: you have the last word, and then I sort of
jump in to save my last word.
we have to talk about that. We still, we've been working together 3 months now, and 2.5 months, and we still need to iron out a couple of wrinkles in this scenario.
But it works.
Yes.
You can still wear a shirt even if it's wrinkled.
You can do anything. It's
Yes.
it's the comment, you know. Hey, look at the mayor. He wearing what's his wife doing? You know, can't he iron a shirt himself? Why isn't his wife looking at her son? You know.
I don't iron. Never.
You did actually write something in your in one of your WhatsApps. You're saying folding takes 5 to 7 business days, and I thought, well, that's an interesting sentence if ever I saw one.
Yes, washing one day, drying one day, folding 5 to 7 business days.
Your husband signed up to this contract, did he?
Yes, he did. And he does the ironing. Whatever he wants ironed, he can, because he irons everything. I don't iron it. His t-shirts, his pants, whatever. You do that.
This is fascinating. Your husband loves shopping, and
yes.
and you don't.
Yes.
He enjoys ironing. You don't. This is becoming quite a revelation. This.
But he hates washing the dishes. I would normally do that.
Yeah, well.
We all have things we like and dislike.
Exactly. And like you said, you're a team, and you sort of complement each other. And so you went through the checklist at first. Do you do this? Yes. Do you do this? Yes. Do you? Okay. I'm taking. Yeah. Buy a husband off the shelf. Yeah.
Yes, something like that.
Something like that. Okay. Right. Janita, I'm going to say all the thank yous, and then I'm really going to let you have the last word, and then I'm going to press on the stop recording button. Okay. So thank you for your time. Thank you for doing this at an ungodly hour of 6 a.m. But I think we can sort of still have a discussion at any time of the day. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your private self as well. I mean, it's you know, think of it as you may, but it's sort of putting it into context how life in South Africa is, and how this life experiences can be processed and shared with other members of the community. That somebody sitting in a totally different part of the planet can say, well, actually, this is not different from what I experienced, so maybe I can speak to her about it and share all of this. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for all the wonderful work you've done this week, painting pineapples and writing and keeping up our LinkedIn page, commenting on that, and so on and so forth. So I really appreciate all of that. Thank you very much for that.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for being a Fruit Loop.
Thank you for being a Fruit Loop.
That's the best.
That's a weird sentence.
Well, it's supposed to be a compliment, but okay.
Thank you.
You just bring color.
I hope you're referring to the color and not the shape.
Well,
I'm joking. Let's move on.
I take the package as it comes. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Because the whole package is just wonderful. So, right. I've said my bit. You have the last word. And when you have said the last word, I'm going to press on the stop recording button.
First of all, thank you for agreeing to this very early meeting at 6 a.m. in the morning. And there's actually another reason for that. You mentioned that you have an off day on Monday, and then I said, well, let's do this early on Friday so you can have the whole Monday to yourself. So there was a reason behind the madness. But thank you very much. And I had a lot of fun today talking about myself and things that happen around South Africa. Because usually I ask you the questions. So it was different for change, but also fun. And for everyone listening or everyone watching, thank you. And we'll see you next time. Or you will hear us next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
We are done. Bye-bye.